What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Wolfgang Münchau, the director and co-founder of Eurointelligence and the author of a phenomenal new book about post-World War II Germany, the rise and fall of the German industrial sector, and the end of what he dubs the German miracle. As I said, this is a phenomenal book, and this was a phenomenal conversation. Wolfgang and I spent the first hour laying the foundation to help us understand how Germany became the economic and financial juggernaut that we have known it to be throughout the 1990s and most of the 21st century. We discussed the two pillars of the German economic miracle, the supercharging of its industrial growth model during the period of globalization and unipolarity, and the cultural, technological, and geopolitical sources of its economic decline. In the second hour, we zero in on the 10 structural sources of German weakness, including the German capital model and banking system, a corporatism that misaligns incentives between the interests of politicians and those of the economy, the fiscal doomsday machine in the form of Germany's debt brake, a radicalizing electorate, and a political mindset among German elite that treats geopolitical risk as an economic externality to be safely discounted or ignored entirely. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io. And I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this incredibly educational and clarifying conversation with my guest, Wolfgang Münchau. Wolfgang Münchau, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's my pleasure having you on, Wolfgang. I have to say your book is incredibly timely. I wanted to do, before it was recommended to me, by one of our Genius community members, I wanted to do a few episodes on Germany, at least one dedicated to its economy and one dedicated to the politics in Germany. Of course, these are so intertwined. And then this book was recommended to me, and it was the perfect book. It was the perfect introduction into Germany for me because it also provided a historical context for why Germany's economy looks the way that it does, the political challenges it faces today. So before we get into all that, I would just love to know a little bit more about your background. How long have you been writing about and thinking about the German economy and German politics?
I've been writing about this since the 1980s. I'm a journalist. I've started journalism in the 1980s. And my interest was mostly European politics and European economics, and Germany played a larger-than-life role in this, and have been writing about this subject, not permanently, but for most of my career, about European politics and economics and about the German economy since about the mid to late 1980s.
So obviously this book is focused on what's happened to Germany and the German economy, but in some sense it's also, it seems to me, a story about the rise and fall of the international rules-based order and of globalization, of which one might argue that Germany was the greatest beneficiary. I'm curious, do you agree with that framing, and how much of that story is synonymous with the story you tell in the book about Germany's economy?
I would agree with that story. This is a story of change. Germany was indeed probably the single greatest beneficiary of globalization. You could probably add China to that. But it was a country that benefited from, that exploited it. The supply chain revolution was a big issue for German companies. The expansion of global markets, the discovery of China as a favorite export market, the strategic link Germany had with Russia. All this would not have happened before the age of globalization. It allowed Germany to sort of internationalize its economic model. It was very much until then a case of made in Germany, but it was able to to internationalize its supply chains, to optimize its supply chains and get countries to produce parts of the import chain. And there was an awful lot of, importing, re-importing, re-exporting going on. It's very difficult to say, how much Germany was actually importing and exporting. I mean, you could take sort of a net look. But on a company basis, it was a very sort of confused picture. Germany was a net exporter of a very significant extent. And that became a characteristic of this model that during that period, Germany created massive export surpluses, current account surpluses, culminating, I think the highest was just at the end of the last decade of about 8.5% of GDP. This is, for a large economy, this is absolutely massive. Small economies do that all the time, like small island economies. But a large economy, this is now the third largest economy in the world. You would not expect, the third largest economy in the world to do this. China does that. But for China to do this, it requires a significant manipulation of savings and investments, of the way the system operates. You would not expect a free market Western economy to generate such a high imbalance. So until about that time, the system seemed to have worked very, very well for Germany.
So we're going to have a chance to get into that in more detail. But one of the things that I mentioned at the top that this book does very well is it builds a foundation for understanding the historical context in which Germany finds itself in today. And you open the book with an anecdote from your time growing up in a city at the western edge of the Ruhr Basin, where you were surrounded by what you described as the two pillars of the German economic miracle. The first is the corporatist industrial model, which we'll get into. And the second was that of the self-made entrepreneur. Can you retell this story for our listeners and explain how it tells the story of the German economic miracle coming out of World War II?
Of course. I grew up in the city of Mülheim. It's a medium-sized city perched between the bigger cities of Essen and Düsseldorf and Duisburg. In the Ruhr Valley, nowadays you consider this the German Rust Belt. It was, like so many Ruhr cities, a place of mechanical engineering. The coal mines had already closed by the time I grew up, but steel industry was still active, and especially the industry that used steel for other purposes. For example, one of the factories I passed on my way to school every morning was a pipeline factory, and they made large pipelines. And today these pipelines are still made in Mülheim, and these are pipelines that are used for to transport gas and oil through the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. And the other company I passed was a company that produced nuclear power reactors, which became the sort of the quintessential source of power of post-war Germany right until about 2 years ago. The other Germany that you mentioned, the entrepreneurial Germany that you mentioned, was also evident in my city because we were the home of the German retail industry. We had two of Germany's largest retailer that had their base in our city. And they were both the creation of individual entrepreneurs. The most famous one was Aldi, which is a big retailer that's now spreading all over Europe. It offers extremely low-priced food products. And the revolution was that he basically took the salespeople out of the chain. And in the olden days, he packaged the Aldi brothers, who were the founders of this company. They just left packages in stores and people just getting, picking up their products in large sort of cartons. It was very basic, but extremely cheap by comparison with the other thing. This is a model that caught on, and it became the most successful retail concept in all of Europe. Karl Albrecht, who lived in my city, was a man who became Germany's richest man. He ranked on the top, I think, 20 list in the world at one point. And what I also found particularly astonishing, especially in comparison to all the, company bosses in Germany today, during his entire life, he never met a German chancellor. Virtually all German CEOs these days, walk in and out of the office of the chancellor all the time. They're political players just as they're corporate players. That was not the case with him. He was a pure corporate guy, didn't care about politics. They left him alone. He left them alone. He was not a sponsor to parties as far as I knew. He was just a purely private individual. So private, in fact, that nobody in our city knew where he lived. And it became a bit of a sort of a hobby of some people to figure out which of the wealthier houses in our town would be his. And we wouldn't have been surprised to know that it would actually, he would have lived in a very ordinary terrace house like most people did. They were kind of very private and, from what we understand, also not very flashy in terms of their habits, in terms of their they were not the kind of people who would drive around in big cars or, eat in expensive restaurants or so. So that it was a generation of true entrepreneurs who were mostly interested in the business themselves rather than the money that made it. They became very rich, no question about that. And that was, I think, the last time Germany had this type of entrepreneurialism. There were other entrepreneurs in the 1980s. There was a competitor to Aldi that was also the creation of an individual, not somebody I know, but this is the company called Lidl, which is a sort of a competitor that's also very successful. There are a number of companies that operated in very specialist mechanical engineering sectors. German companies are very good at, Germans are very good at mechanical engineering, and some people just got themselves into business producing better screws or better gearboxes or small components that were so highly specialized that they had knowledge in producing. So Germany carved out market niches in many areas of engineering. And so until about that time, 70s, 1980s, that was sort of the last big phase of, the entrepreneurial Germany. And then things really changed.
So we're going to obviously have a chance to talk about why things have changed and why things changed. I'm curious to understand, though, as a non-German, most non-Germans think of Germans as hardworking, regimented, and as part of, one of the most formidable industrial workforces on the planet. They don't necessarily think of them as entrepreneurial. So it was interesting for me in the book to read about this history of entrepreneurialism in Germany. Was this a cultural artifact, something that, where did this come from, and how long was an entrepreneurial spirit alive in this country?
The entrepreneurial spirit occurred in two phases. The first one was the late 19th century, when that was a time when Germany was the most advanced country in the world in physics and chemistry and also in engineering. This was a sort of the golden age. I wrote about the University of Göttingen. This is one of Germany's most famous universities at the time. It accounted for over 14 Nobel Prize winners in the pre-war era. Some of the world's most famous mathematicians. There's an unlikely cluster of famous mathematicians taught there. And all that changed, obviously, with the Second World War. Many of these scientists were Jewish. Most of them left before the Nazis came to power or in the early years of the power. Some were murdered. Some committed suicide. But the majority left. And by the end of the war, Germany had obviously lost the cutting edge in those disciplines, but it hadn't lost the cutting edge in engineering. And as the country sort of tried to rebuild itself from rubble in the 50s, there was a second generation or a second phase of entrepreneurialism, the one that gave rise to the economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s. These were an awful lot of companies that were created at that time by people who were just entrepreneurs. They had opportunity. Regulation was low, taxes were low. This was a country that was very friendly to entrepreneurialism. So the point I wanted to make is that whether we are entrepreneurial or not is not really to do with our national culture. Germany had phases when it was and phases when it wasn't. And today is clearly a phase when it isn't. And when it really, really isn't. It's a very long way away from that. There have been changes, we can talk about these, but the country today is very different. And entrepreneurs still exist, and there's still young people who want to be entrepreneurs. But to the extent that Germans are entrepreneurs today, they are more likely to be entrepreneurs abroad than at home.
Okay, so I pulled a quote from the book. I actually did this a number of times, and I'm going to do it a number of times during the interview. This one I particularly liked it because I feel like it sums up the story that you tell in it and that we've started to tell now. And in describing the predicament that Germany finds itself in, you write, quote, "The world changed, but Germany did not. And this is a story of how Germany mismanaged industrial capitalism and misjudged technology and geopolitics. It is also a story of national narratives, the myths we keep telling each other and eventually start to believe. And like all tragedies, this one begins during the good times. So obviously a lot of questions come up there, including one about national narratives and the myths we tell ourselves. But what are those good times? So we've talked a little bit about Germany coming out of World War II, the entrepreneurialism. When did things begin to change, and what are those good times that you're focusing in on in this particular quote?
In this particular quote, the good times I was focusing on were the period after unification. So I'm not going back to the 60s or 70s. It's not, so unification 1989.
Well, let's go. I want to make sure just in that case, because I do want to go through that. I don't remember exactly where I pulled it from, but I would like to actually go as early as we can in terms of identifying, because there were two stages, I believe. So we'll definitely have a chance to get into the unification portion. But if there's something that we're leaving out, I definitely would like you to cover it.
Okay, the early phases that I detected of where things went wrong was in the 1980s. In the 1970s, the German government under Chancellor Willy Brandt, who was a social democrat, had a not a working group, but a committee that had foreseen the information revolution. And they said we need to work towards optical fiber networks and digital networks. And Germany was one of the first countries that recognized this. So in the early 70s, things were still ahead of the time, and certainly right up there with anybody in terms of keeping a pace of modern technological developments. And had they followed the plan that they laid out in those years, Germany would have been one of the global tech leaders. They certainly would have had optical fiber coverage by now. They're still struggling. It's one of the laggards in Europe today. But it went wrong in the 1980s when Helmut Kohl came to power. He wasn't interested in anything that was digital. He prioritized a different project, which was HDTV, a high-definition television, but based on an existing old analog standard. It was him and his partner in crime, François Mitterrand, the French president, who both championed this project. It was supposed to be the sort of it became a technical white elephant, but it was supposed to be, technology for the ordinary person to enjoy. And he wanted something that would exist in sort of finite political time, something that would happen, would help him getting reelected, rather than something that would happen in 30 or 40 years, which he couldn't care less about. And that was the moment when Germany stopped or started to be deflected away from development of digital technologies. And it was in that period that sort of an anti-digital mindset was created. There was one incident which I didn't write in the book, which I recall. It was a committee in the German Bundestag, the parliament, which discussed email in the early 1990s. And one of the members stood up and said, we don't need this thing because we have a very well-functioning telegraph service. That became sort of endemic of the mindset that existed in Germany, very skeptical towards, not generally towards the computer, but towards the modern, the internet, the fledgling internet that sort of started to come out in the early 1990s. This was sort of the moment where they parted company with the technological modernity. They were dragging their feet. They were still stuck in analog technologies. On telecommunications, I was writing the story of a manager of Siemens, a company that was actually at the time a producer of mobile telephone systems, but they decided this wasn't for them. They were more interested in telephone exchanges. And they were a producer of analog telephone exchanges at the time and felt that this was a much more profitable business. The culture of Germany that's sort of around the 1990s was very much based on the analog world. This was the time when the car companies optimized the engines. This was the time when they started to become really clever about diesel engines. It is technological a marvel. I have to tell you that I don't understand how these engines work. They are very complicated. And what I understand is the optimization, the quality they produce was of the highest order. So they really managed to get a lead in this sector, and it kept on giving. It was a very successful product, and the fuel-driven car was an invention of the 19th century. But it kept on giving until about a few years ago.
Well, as a child of the 1990s, this part of the book was fascinating. First of all, I didn't know about the extent of this technophobia that exists in Germany. You also tell a story, and maybe you can tell it later, of a particular individual who has a very large following in Germany who is not just technophobic, like very anti-technology. So that was fascinating. But there was also like an element of nostalgia for me that came up, because it also made me realize just maybe how silly some of my dreams are, because I do miss a lot of the analog world. There's a lot about the modern world today that is challenging for at least some of us to live in culturally. And so in a sense, what you find is in Germany, it seems almost like a bit of an experiment in what happens if we try to stave off modernity.
Oh, indeed. I don't think it was quite so consciously. And here I would say it was a cultural thing. And I think it is to do with the fact that the internet was the first technology that had no German involvement. The Germans were sort of involved in the early stage of the sort of electronic revolution. They were, after all, the German scientists invented, or at least discovered quantum physics. They were quite, they had decent competitive electronics or electrics companies. They produced television sets and radios and hi-fi systems. So until about the 60s and 70s, Germany was still right up there. And the computer was not a German invention, but they produced computers and at a reasonable profit. And there were German computer companies. There were German software companies. And still today, one of the very few European software giants, SAP, was a creation of that period, 1970. So Germany was sort of right up there until about the 1970s, 1980s. And then things started to diverge with the personal computer. That was obviously not something the Germans invented. And then the internet, that was something that was really alien to them. And Angela Merkel still said it in 2013, that the internet is new territory for us. That was 2013. It was we had the iPhone 7 by then or something. This was something, and I heard the story the other day from a car dealer in Germany who had apparently told somebody that he felt the internet was a temporary phenomenon. I mean, that is today, 2024. So people still, it's not, how could you say this when you basically, are tuned to the world? And it was around the 1990s where that happened. And I always, the Germans are no Luddites. They get taught, maths in school and, even computing and computer science and engineering. But this was not a technology they had invented. And there was a feeling that this was a game. It was a bit like Hollywood. They never took Hollywood serious. Hollywood's a huge industry, but it was always the case, okay, we do this and they do that. And, let them do digital, let us do the, engineering for adults. And it was always seen as our stuff is bigger anyway. If you look at the turnover of German companies, even back then, Microsoft and IBM, they were tech giants, but they were not giants compared to these large German conglomerates that produced, heavy moving equipment and chemicals and all this stuff. So they didn't feel that this was an industry that they wanted to get into. And companies were not particularly interested in either. There wasn't a lot of pressure for the government to invest in fiber optic cables or in later mobile telephone networks. So it became a foreign intrusion. They did, however, and I have to say, there was a short moment when it appeared to go in the other direction. And that was in the late 90s when the dot-com bubble happened. And that was a period when Germany kind of discovered the new world. And then people were saying, oh my God, this is the future. And unfortunately, in Germany, the dot-com bubble was wilder than it was in any other country I know. And that had to do with the fact that companies were registered on a new stock market. It was a specially created new stock market created for tech stocks, sort of you could say the German Nasdaq, but nothing as mature and nothing as sophisticated. And it was an unregulated sort of penny stock market. And lots of companies went on it, but most of these companies were not very good. And this market generated a tulip-style bubble, not only in quality, but also in sort of size, in terms of how much money went into it, in terms of the valuations. And this market completely collapsed like the tulip bubble. And I calculated the number, and I don't have it in my head, 95%, 97% fall from peak to bottom. So people who invested in this market got completely wiped out. And that was an experience. And that was during the period when Gerhard Schröder was in power. It was the period of the Social Democrats and the Greens in power in Berlin. And this was sort of the first sort of backlash against the economy. And the German chancellor then, was very much, like they all were, very much sort of analog era creatures, and fine-tuned his economic policy very much to the needs of big industry, of old industry, and the whole this whole new tech internet bubble went. Now, in the United States, as we all know, the dot-com bubble was not the end of dot-com, it was the beginning of dot-com. It was just the beginning of new companies. This was the age of Google and then Facebook and others. That was not the case in Germany. In Germany, it really ended the enthusiasm for sort of modernity. And then they had a few other ventures. One was called Wirecard, which was a financial fintech company that became one of the biggest cases of fraud in German history. So their experience with this modern world was one of either fraud or financial collapse. It was not something they were comfortable with. Many people didn't understand this. And so they sought refuge in something they were good at. And that was, engineering, chemicals, cars, steel. These were the big ones.
So it seems almost like the classic innovator's dilemma. But instead of happening at Intel or Kodak, it happened nationwide. And that the bubble in the tech stocks in the late 90s basically served as a story that the German people could tell themselves to say, see, we were right. We need to stick to what we're good at. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. This is the innovator's dilemma, except that in a country like the US, no such innovator would be representative of the whole country. If one company, if Intel fails, there's another company that succeeds. The way Germany works is an economy that works through consensus. And this consensus engulfs the government, it includes the corporate sector. It also incorporates the media that very much tell the story of this consensus. And this is a country different from others, which if they go wrong, they go wrong. There aren't any whistleblowers out there and there aren't any people who say, I disagree, I invest in something else. This is what a capital market does. A capital market does not work by consensus. A betting market does not work by consensus. These markets do not work that way. But Germany, with its banking system, works that way. So this was a case of a nation committing an error of judgment. And there were no correctives to this error of judgment. Markets provide an error, a corrective mechanism, but the market mechanism has not been able to kick in because the way the German markets work, they're not sufficiently sophisticated or developed.
Is this a part of what, or an outgrowth of what you have described as the neo-mercantilist mindset?
The neo-mercantilism is indeed related to this idea. The word neo-mercantilist has two words. One is mercantilist, and this is the old 17th, 16th, 17th, 1800 French tradition of amassing gold through export surpluses. This is how the old gold standard worked. The German system also seeks export surpluses. It's no longer about gold. This is why I called it the neo-mercantilism. Today, this is about achieving large profits for companies, profits that these companies use to create jobs, social structures at home. So this was basically a compact between workers and industrialists that they created and for which they needed to generate large export surpluses in order to fund it. Now, a large export surplus is something that needs to be absorbed by somebody else. Mercantilists never cared about this because there was always somebody in the world, like the United States, that would always do this. In Europe, you had the UK as a large absorber of current account surpluses. It's not the case anymore, but that was the case back in those days. The US is still the world's largest absorber. China runs a very similar policy to Germany. So we had these global imbalances that Germany created. And that's what basically this neo-mercantilist system was. And it, like mercantilists anywhere, they like physical goods. That's what mercantilists do. Mercantilists are not entrepreneurs. Mercantilists are established companies that work together with the politicians and the bankers who basically achieve some overarching goal like a surplus, like a trade surplus. And that became the German model. And if you ever talk about it, like in any country, there is a debate between the left and the right. But whether you're on the left or the right, they all tend to support this model. There isn't anybody, there aren't not many people in Germany who say, let's loosen up a little bit. Let's try to do something different. Let's try to become less dependent on these economies or these industries. And, let's give some breathing space for entrepreneurs. That exists on the political fringes, but it's not mainstream.
That's also fascinating, which is that I learned from your book, which is that the fringe parties are even more invested in this model, more invested in this maybe make Germany great again idea of doubling down and tripling down on the golden years.
That's right. What the French party, especially if you look at the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, which is a far-right party, I've always say this: don't mix them up with Trump. This is not Trump. Trump is an ultra-libertarian, whereas these guys are not. They are wedded to the old industrial model. Also on the left, there's now a new French party that arose on the left, and they both have together about 25% of the vote. So they have a very large share of the popular vote. They both hanker back to the good old days, as they believe they were, where Germany got its cheap gas from Russia, where it was, in business with Putin, where it was focused on industrial production. Sarah Wagenknecht, who is the leader of this French party of the left, she always said industry is what we're good at, and therefore we have to return to that. So this is also the position of the center-left party. When Olaf Scholz recently discovered that he had an economic crisis, he invited the chairman of all the car companies, the chemical companies, and the steel companies. To him, that is the German economy. And on the right, then there was a counter summit. It was a little bit of a ridiculous show where they invited the leaders of the so-called Mittelstand. These are the medium to small to medium-sized companies that produce also analog era mechanical engineering. These were the companies that were mostly founded in the 1950s and are highly specialized and some highly successful, but still specialized in a different technological, phase of modern development. And there wasn't anyone who was particularly interested in entrepreneurs, the whole sort of startup scene. There aren't that many in Germany. There are some, there are some people who try in adverse circumstances. And I write about some stories in the book of what happened to some of these startup companies. But in general, they don't have political support in Germany.
So going back to the passage I quoted earlier, we've talked about how Germany mismanaged industrial capitalism, how they mismanaged technology. What about geopolitics? What went wrong there?
The focus on industry that Gerhard Schröder brought back in the early 2000s led to a realization that this cannot happen unless Germany supplied stable and cheap sources of energy. The politics of that period was that Gerhard Schröder, the SPD chancellor, was in a coalition with the Green Party. It was the only power option for his party at the time. And the Green Party insisted on a phasing out of nuclear energy. That now happened actually 2 years ago, but it started in the early 2000s. Schröder concluded that in order to plug the gap that Germany would be left with a phasing out of nuclear energy would have to be filled by gas. And as a result, he became very friendly with Vladimir Putin, who acceded to power at around the time when he did, at the turn of the century. And they actually became personal friends. And later, when Schröder left office in 2005, Putin gave him the job of building the pipelines that have crossed the Baltic Sea from somewhere near St. Petersburg in Russia to eastern Germany. These pipelines bypassed other European countries, certainly the Baltic republics and Poland. It was a Russian-German venture. The gas was then fed into a domestic German pipeline, and it was made available to German companies at knockdown prices. And in particular, the gas contracts were long-term, so that they were not subject to vagaries of financial market pricing. They could calculate their energy costs. Germany never had the cheapest energy costs. It was not like it was undercutting others, but it was stable and relatively cheap. And that became the mantra in German politics, that we needed to have these relationships because our model depended on it.
It depended on cost competitiveness.
On cost competitiveness, but especially on cost competitive energy supplies. But you're right, it depended on cost competitiveness in general. So the reforms that the Schröder government did was to reform the welfare system such that it would lead to a fall or at least moderation of wages. And that, in fact, succeeded. German wages had not risen very much in those years from 2005 to 2015, it was a period of extraordinary wage moderation. Germany did become more competitive. The exchange rate fell because of the Eurozone crisis. So that was another boost to German competitiveness. And then these gas pipelines came on stream. I think the first one came on stream in the early 2010s. And the gas was cheap. So Germany had everything basically going for it. Until about 2015, when a number of things started to change. And the first thing that changed was 2014, when Putin invaded or annexed Crimea. That was the beginning of something that now later turned into a full-scale war for which Germany was not prepared. Germany chose to ignore the annexation of Crimea and continued to insist that its pipeline had nothing to do with this. And the famous statement by people on the left and the right was that we have to keep business and politics separate. And they tried to do this until about 2022, when Putin did invade Ukraine, at which point that position was no longer sustainable. In fact, they tried to sustain it in the beginning. When Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, he only cut off the new pipeline, Nord Stream 2. He did concede that to the Americans. The Americans were opposed to the whole Nord Stream business because it made Germany dependent on Russia. It was simply, they saw it as a security risk, and so did pretty much everyone else in Europe. So Scholz's concession was, okay, we're not going to expand the capacity. We're just going to close that newly built Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but we keep the old one open. But then 6 months later, the old one was blown up. Initially, everyone suspected the Russians. Later, it emerged that a Ukrainian commando was the most likely source. It was not necessarily a Ukrainian government commando, but it was a privately funded operation. And that internally, that again encouraged people in Germany to talk about conspiracies, anti-German conspiracies that might have been at play. So Germany has become, in this period from 2015 to today, a lot of things went wrong for them, or everything that went right, and they were lucky. I mean, this was the period until about that time was lucky. They got an exchange rate worked in their favor. They got the wages that worked in their favor. The energy became cheaper. The supply chain became more efficient and international. The markets were bigger. Suddenly they had markets everywhere in the world. China and Germany were compatible in that period. The Chinese would produce consumer goods, and the Germans would produce the plants that made the consumer goods. So this was a dream of an economic boom, and many people mistook this as a sustainable economic model, which it wasn't.
That statement, we have to keep business and politics separate, is remarkable and sounds remarkably naive in the context of where the world is today. We talked a bit about the 1990s, but we didn't go into the level of detail that I think we should. I'm going to throw out a few things that happened in the 90s that I have identified as the most important, and I'd love to hear from you on whether you agree, what you would add to that. One is an easy one, an obvious one, which is the investment boom in China and China's economic demand for German industrial machinery, components, and know-how. Another that a lot of people are not familiar with is the liberalization of container shipping and logistics. And I'm curious to understand where that really sits in all of this, which obviously came hand in glove with globalization and the fall of the Soviet Union and the eventual entry of China into the WTO. And another really big one is the signing of Maastricht Treaty and European Monetary Union. Those to me seemed like the most important ones that happened in that decade, but I'm curious if you would add anything else to that list and if you'd care to elaborate on those.
I think this list would suggest, I think this is a good list. Maastricht gave Germany a single currency. In the beginning, Germany was opposed to the single currency because it felt that it was it would bring inflation. But the way it was ultimately decided had very much the opposite effect. And it guaranteed Germany stable exchange rates. And that was, for German industry, the best thing that could ever happened. It made sure that there was no European country, at least, that could devalue against Germany. That was always the case before. There were French companies, Italian companies that would sporadically devalue and gain themselves competitive advantages in that period. That was no longer possible. And the countries then had to work through the consequences of the stable exchange rate, through other means, much more painful means. So the Monetary Union was a big deal, especially combined with the fact that Germany managed to cut its wage costs, or at least managed to allow its wage costs to rise by less than any other European countries. In that period, Germany did improve its cost competitiveness against the rest of Europe. The supply chain revolution that you alluded to, the liberalization of container shipping and also technical advancements. And one of them was the just-in-time production technology. This was first invented or mooted in the early 1990s, which was an optimization of a supply chain arrangement such that the inputs to your factory wouldn't be stored anywhere. They would be, the container ship or the rail container would drive into your factory, and it would offload the material pretty much in time onto your conveyor belt. So the whole system was so perfectly optimized. But then that was clearly exposed during the pandemic when this no longer worked. But it worked until it did. And it generated significant efficiencies. The supply chain for a product as complicated as a motor car. I mean, an engine has 5,000 parts, and then there are other things. I mean, this is not something you can produce locally. So each of these parts had to produce somewhere. Many were produced in Germany, but also many in China and many in other parts of the world. And this became a giant optimization exercise to get everything together without having to store this material. So the container shipment, the freedom, the cheapness of container shipment, there were later in the 2010s, China built transportation links by rail through Russia. And there were three sort of parallel lines that go through. One went through the northern line, a middle line, one went through sort of Turkey in the south. They had different sort of efficiencies, but the whole idea was now for China also to link into this market, and China playing a very similar logistics game. The idea was basically to connect up the various parts of the Eurasian continent. The Russians came in with an idea of an Arctic sea route. And now that we have climate change, there are a lot of these Arctic sea ice is melting. So you could create an alternative route from China to Europe rather than going through the Suez Canal. And nowadays, Cape Horn, you would take the Arctic sea route. And that was shorter. So there was an awful lot of planning going on ideas of really optimizing European supply chains in that period.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about China, and I think you made this point in the book, Germany was a huge beneficiary of China's rise, but at the same time, they are also now becoming victims of its position in the global trading system. In other words, they wanted them to be successful, but not so successful that they would replace them. What's interesting is when we look at the example of China's rise, when we look at globalization hand in glove with container logistics and just-in-time manufacturing, these are two trends that have reversed. And not the reversal of the rise of China, but China's integration into the global system. The European Monetary Union so far has held together. I think maybe that's an interesting question to ask, which is what your view is on the future of EMU. Before I ask that, or in conjunction with it, I'm just curious, you mentioned wage suppression in Germany. This, of course, was key to the cost competitiveness. It wasn't just about cheap Russian energy. It was also about cost competitive, qualified labor. Was the main mechanism by which Germany suppressed wages via the exchange rate, or were there other things that were important?
The wage suppression worked because of the system of industrial relations. Wages are set in Germany by negotiations between trade unions and employers' associations. The trade unions are still very powerful even today. And in that period, 2005, Germany had, before the reforms, Germany's welfare system became, I wouldn't say bloated, but it was very generous. And the method that Schröder used is to cut down on welfare payments. So it made alternatives to work extremely unpleasant through a period of reform. So all the ability to take off time from work, like a few months or years, all that became less lucrative, and people had to apply for a new form of welfare assistance. If they refused jobs, that money would be cut. So it was a difficult one. And what helped them was demographics. It was the generation of the boomers, who were then in the 40s and 50s, who had become very averse to the idea of unemployment. Because if you had been fired in Germany in the time and you were an industrial worker, if you had been fired at the age of 50, you would not get another job. Unemployment was high at the time. Unemployment was at 5 million, over 10% of the workforce. It was an environment that was very conducive to wage repression, Today, it's totally the opposite. The boomers have retired. The younger generation does not care about jobs and job security anywhere nearly as much as the older ones. They're taking whatever money they can get. Wage inflation is actually quite high, especially in the services sector. The union's grip on these wages is much lower than it used to be. So people are negotiating non-unionized wages, which can often exceed those of the unionized sector. So you have a completely different dynamics that cannot be repeated. I mean, you mentioned everything went into reverse. In fact, it's true, everything went into reverse. Not just geopolitics and energy, but the exchange rate, the demographics, the relationship with China. The important part of China, I mean, China obviously became part of the world trading system, but China and Germany were massively complementary. And Germany then later realized that China was starting to encroach on German goods. They bought up the German solar panel industry and repatriated it to China. That was sort of the first sort of time when people sort of publicly realized that something wasn't quite right. And the Germans always thought, we have to make sure that China, we keep them down, but not completely out. And, as we say in the UK, this is sort of too clever by half, because the Chinese decided to encroach on German technologies. They have more than we in Europe do, and sense that they need to be independent of the rest of the world. And they didn't want to be dependent on Germany for factories and machine tools. So they built their own industries, and they are quite competitive. In many sectors, Chinese products are very competitive, and not just price competitive, but also competitive on quality. Prices. Chinese engineering is not bad engineering. And Chinese electric cars are not just cheap cars, they are actually quite good cars, and they're actually hard to compete against. So that's something that Germany underestimated, and Germany ran very large trade surpluses against China, and that has completely flipped. China is one of the very few countries now that runs trade surpluses against Germany, because Germany is buying more from China. The German companies integrated more into China. Speaking about China, there was something we mentioned before on geopolitics, the sort of geopolitical naiveness. And I said earlier that the country takes sort of consensual judgments across politics and business. And businesses, until very recently, continue to invest in China, despite the fact that the relationship between the West and China already started to deteriorate in the later part of the last decade when Huawei was sanctioned. German companies kept on investing into China, and some are still keeping on investment into China. They were largely ignorant of the geopolitical world around us. BASF, the chemical company, is hugely invested into China. They're building one of their biggest plants ever in China. They say, the chairman used to say, China is the future. And that's sort of a view shared by the German car industry. VW, Mercedes have 30-40% of their sales in China. So they are massively dependent on the Chinese market. And there wasn't a German chancellor who ever, in those days, Merkel never told them to be careful, because geopolitics could turn again, you're building up a risk for your company. I cannot guarantee that the geopolitics is going to be as benign in the future as it was in the past. There was no sense of that. The whole country became sort of geopolitically incompetent. And in the German corporate sector, people who warned about China or who warned about Russia were sidelined. There was a case I describe in my book of a manager of BASF who raised the issue of China dependence and who had to leave because, that was the company's policy. It was to be pro-China. So it is another example where this consensus model can go wrong. When everybody makes a mistake, there aren't companies that say, look, listen, we don't actually think so. We do something different. That was not cool, basically.
So the conversation about demographics obviously brings up immigration. And we'll have a chance to talk about that because you write quite a bit in the book about how the German political system makes it difficult and, in fact, doesn't just disincentivize high-scaled immigration to Germany, but also high-scaled immigration of Germans back to Germany, which is quite self-defeating, both in cases of maybe children. For example, your children would have a more difficult time going back in some cases, and even you have some cases of professors who wanted to return and chose not to. I also want to point out that the real self-goal or own goal that Germany has experienced on an energy front has also meant that it is losing out not just on feedstock industries that take in natural gas or industrial plants, but also things like AI training models. I also think, for people that heard what you had to say and hear echoes of Michael Pettis, I definitely want to recommend they go back and listen to my conversation with Michael, and in particular, how he describes the Chinese model suppressing consumption and elevating savings through the welfare system by making it difficult, forcing people essentially to have to save more, which is money that then gets rerouted through the banking system. Wolfgang, I'm going to move us to the second hour of this conversation, and I want to give listeners an idea of where we're going to go. So one thing I do want to do is reconcile what may seem like a paradox for people, which is that Germany's economy in some ways experienced its best period between 2005 and 2017. And in fact, the European exchange rate was, I think, 160 to the dollar, or the dollar was 160 for every euro, I think in 2009, which also raises the question of the euro crisis. And I think that also was a boon to the German economy. We'll have a chance to talk about that. We'll have a chance to talk about the three pillars of the German banking system, the private banks, the state banks, and the mutual banks. I want to talk a little bit more about green tech because this really was an industry that Germany was in a great position to dominate. And I wonder if that's still something that can be reversed for them, what that looks like. You also mentioned that your real concern for the European Union and for the future of the euro is a crisis in Europe's core. You don't actually say that, but you describe it essentially by focusing on the relationship between France and Germany, the single most important relationship in Europe. That's something I want to talk about. And then I want to end it with a conversation about best and worst case scenarios. And that'll also bring up an opportunity to talk about German politics and some of these new coalitions that could be formed coming out of the next elections. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Wolfgang, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Wolfgang, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.